This lecture introduces Spanish architecture and sculpture as unique from, as it developed that is, its Italian and northern counterparts. Whereas the Italians will prefer pure white marble, the Spanish will introduce polychromy and realism for a direct connection to religious figures. They also will adopt Italianate models for their architecture, but ensure that they are much more reserved, refined, and pared down. The Spanish in the 17th century are going to control a vast amount of geographical territory, not only in Europe, but throughout the world. They control Flanders in the north, Spain proper, and then southern Italy, Sicily, and Sardinia. Here we have a print of everything Spain controlled, showing Spain itself, or Hispania, as a female allegorical figure, crowned and holding a globe with a cross surmounting it and holding a scepter in her left hand. We find that it shows the Habsburgs, the ruling family in Spain, that they controlled Flanders, Sardinia, Sicily, Naples, the Americas, and India, and were also allied with their Austrian counterparts and cousins. This meant that they controlled a vast geographical expanse and were the richest country in the 16th century. Now, the Moors had conquered all of Spain by 732. The northern expansion was only halted when the Frank or Frenchman, Charles Martel, later nicknamed the Hammer for the Battle of Tours, is going to halt their advance. Thus, all of Spain was under Muslim control until the Reconquista. Now, the Reconquista, which lasted 800 years, involved a series of battles, not only with the Spanish, but also supported by other European powers, including the English, Irish, and French, where they fought battle after battle to push the Moors or North Africans back into Africa. They then, in 1492, at the conclusion of the Reconquista, are going to expel even converts who want to stay in the country and convert to Catholicism. So by the 16th century, Spain will become the most powerful nation. We see the expansion of the Christian territories in the north as they press from France downward, from 711 until 1492, eventually pushing them out of their final strongholds down at Almira in Granada. Now, Spain would be the dominant nation militarily, and as far as their navy is concerned, they were the best and most powerful navy, controlling the Atlantic, until the Spanish Armada was defeated in August of 1588. Through a series of battles with the British, we find that half the fleet will be lost and half the Armada lost, as the British are going to claim victory and start their own dominance in the Atlantic. The final blow is going to be dealt to the Spanish fleet with the sack of Cadiz in 1596, where the rest of the fleet is destroyed. Now, in the 16th century, prior to the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the vast wealth and resources of Spain is going to be tracked by their trading routes with the Americas seen here. Between 1492 and 1504, we can see a regular route that would have taken them to South America, the Caribbean, and then bringing the gold and silver back to Spain. Obviously, the port cities of Cadiz and Lisbon would have been very rich at this time. So with the discoveries that we have here in England and Spain and Portugal in the 16th century seen in the map, conquests are going to remain close to the shoreline where they could land and easily conduct raids. But as the silver mines of Mexico and Peru stop producing at this time, we know that by the end of the century they're on the verge of bankruptcy. And by the 17th century, Spain will be the poorest nation in Europe. There is a stark difference here, more so than any other country, between the wealthy, the aristocrats, the royal family, or the poor. In addition to that, Spain in this century is also dominated by what later in the Romantic tradition dominates the mind when they think of Spain, and that is the Spanish Inquisition and the rather brutal treatment of heretical and political dissonance. Now we know that Spain has the most corrupt administration and the least tolerant view and treatment of unorthodox religious beliefs, for they would exile Jews and Muslim converts. Even though they convert to Catholicism, they would, of course, question them, torment them, and eventually expel them or kill them. Now what we need to remember is the Spanish Inquisition is not monitored and is not an arm of the papacy or of the Catholic Church itself, but instead they received the ability and the permission of the Pope back in the 15th century to start their own state arm in 1478 of the Inquisition. Thus it was primarily used as a political tool rather than a religious tool to ensure conformity to the king's beliefs and unquestioning of his principles and of his dictates. Now, what is ironic about the 17th century in Spain, even though they were the poorest nation, even though the least tolerant, this is the Spanish Golden Age, in which we have many important cultural productions, including Cervantes' Don Quixote, written and published between 1605 and 15. We have the wonderful playwrights Lope de Vega and Pedro de la Barca. We also have many important artists, including Diego Velázquez, Giuseppe de Ribera, Francisco de Zurbarán, and Bartolomé Murillo. All of these are going to contribute to this golden age of culture in Spain. The kings in Spain, we know, were the primary art collectors and patrons, and would of course pay for the lodgings, training, and the lifestyle of Diego Velázquez, Giuseppe de Ribera, Francisco de Zurbarán, and Bartolomé Murillo. Turning to the capital, which is Madrid, only made the capital by the mid-16th century, we have an explosion in building taking place. Even though there was an economic decline in the latter 16th century, we know that new building projects are going to be used to advertise the strength of the Spanish Empire. With Philip II establishing a fixed capital at Madrid in 1561, we have an explosion in building, though haphazard, that continues until by 1617 there are 150,000 inhabitants here, which of course is going to be a great explosion in population, and so you have these medieval wandering backbone-like streets. Although they do attempt to preserve some type of order in major plazas, such as the most important one, the Plaza Mayor. Meandering through the streets of Renaissance Spain and Madrid, we would of course see a type of chaos and confusion of design, but not in the major places designed by and for the king. Here, the architect being Juan Gómez de Mora in the Plaza Mayor. Completed between 1617 and 19, we have a very organized open area for public events. Thus, the urban design, which was purposeful and controlled and elegant for the Spanish court, was designed for urban fiestas and pageants. The multi-leveled design here is reflective of its Renaissance predecessors, though embodying the traditional Spanish decoration. The plaza, or piazza in Italian, is designed for gatherings and pageants and is going to have the same severe restraint that was modeled on and after El Escorial. The king at the time, who needs to assert himself and to establish a new capital, is Philip II. So Philip is a very popular name among Spanish kings that we will see leading up to the 30 Years' War and even into the 18th century. So Philip II here rules until 1598, and he will adopt a classical Italianate idiom that comes to be known as the unornamented style, or the estilo desornamentado. The unornamented style, right, is going to be a severe version of Italianate classicism, stripped of flourishes and excessive decoration as the Spanish would see it, which is a wonderful metaphor for how the Spanish see themselves and their rule, as uncompromising, as not complicated, as straightforward. They are Orthodox Catholics, and that is all. Now you find that until this point, there had been no fixed
capital. So even though in 1492 Spain as we know it comes into being, it is not until 1561 that there is a fixed capital in Madrid, that being a place where the king is going to be located and his court is going to surround him. Now that is going to be here at the El Escorial, where he's going to patronize especially Venetian artists. The Spanish really appreciate the straightforward textural illusion and interest in textures that the Venetians are going to specialize in, and what they can do with oil painting. And so a series of poesia are made for the Spanish king by Titian. And they would have been housed here in the Capitol building of El Escorial. So the building, the Capitol, which includes the living quarters for the king, a main church to show the unification of church and state, and the rooms for all of the servants and the courtiers, with this unornamented style, was designed by Juan Bautista de Toledo and Juan de Herrera. These artists had traveled to Italy to study, and their designs are going to express just that. In this Italianate geometric clarity common among Renaissance palaces, much like we saw at the Chateau of Fontainebleau for Francis I, you will notice that we have a bilaterally symmetrical composition whereby we can transect this plan down the middle and it folds over relatively equally, all surrounded by and coming to a head with the church and the dome for this church, showing that there is no question that the religious center of Spain is going to be paramount. Now here we have the facades that would have inspired the architects, especially Herrera, who spent over a decade, 12 years in Italy, absorbing the architecture of his contemporaries. I show you as an example here the Chiesa Nuova, that's going to be a very standard Baroque facade, which is two-storied, that's going to have engaged columns below, generally with flat and engaged pilasters above. So here we have the engaged columns in this temple front. You have your standard entablature, much like we have seen in other examples such as Palladian architecture. And then you're going to have a pediment above. In this case, it's on top of a second series of engaged columns. But you'll notice, even though we have the two stories, we have the columns and entablature running down the center and a pediment at the apex of the entrance to El Escorial, that it is stripped down, that it is not as ornate. There are less sculptural flourishes and decorations. The columns, you'll notice, are going to be Doric order on the bottom and Ionic order on the top, much like with the Colosseum moving from one to the next. Whereas in the Italianate version, you'll notice they use the Corinthian order, much more decorative flourishes and elements. So this estilo desornamentado is going to represent the Spanish monarchy in general and how their reach of power is global at this point, much like the Roman emperor. So they are going to adopt these stripped down, reserved, and grave images from the Roman Empire and its architecture.
The unified house facades and simple bricks surrounding these designs for the aristocracy show the austere granite colonnades that reflect Juan de Herrera and Juan Bautista de Toledo's design for the royal palace at El Escorial. The unornamented style seen here is going to have that combination of classical and Italian forms that are meant to represent the Spanish monarchy and its reach of power. Thus, they are saying they are as cultured and refined as those in Italy, the capital of the art world until mid-century. As far as the design of this unornamented style, we see it repeated elsewhere, in commissions by and for, I should state, Queen Margherita of Austria, the wife of Philip III, who paid for the founding of a monastery, l'Encarnacion, built between 1611 and 16 in Madrid. Here, the architects Juan Gómez de Mora and Fray Alberto de la Madre de Dios are going to design the facade of La Encarnacion in order to reflect this estilo desornamentado. So it updates it in this instance, keeping the austerity and the severity of El Escorial, but making it appropriate for a church. The design, like El Escorial, is going to be plain with a giant order of flat pilasters flanking either side of this facade, with a tripartite porch, that being there are 3 archways on the first level, flanking a large central archway. And the severity can be seen here as the stones are dressed and flush. Nothing like the very dramatic and interactive theatrical facades that we see developing in Italy. The Spanish will always be suspicious of innovation and challenges to traditional beliefs and designs. Now, the most original church facade that we have in the Baroque period in Spain comes by way of the Granada Cathedral, which was begun in 1553, but the facade finished later. Here, Alonso Cano is going to continue a design originally by another architect, which was tripartite, updating the Italian tradition. So this facade was begun later in the century in 1667. It reflects the 3 arches or main central nave and side aisles on the interior. The interior, of course, was updated in the 18th century to reflect the later late Baroque or Rococo appreciation for gold stucco work and, of course, the white interior space. The facade was originally begun by Diego de Celeo, and it conforms to his original tripartite design, which of course was influenced by one of the most important ancient Roman monuments in the Forum Romanum. This is going to be the Arch of Constantine, who was considered the first Christian emperor at the time in the Renaissance and Baroque eras. So we find here it is similar in design in that it has a taller central archway flanked by 2 other arches. That's tripartite, just as the last design that we saw. But it is supported by piers that are inset and not columns. So we'll notice that much like a sunken relief, it is inset. The columns are going to protrude much more aggressively outward and comes as close as we see in Spain to those interactive designs that are more common in Italy. Thus we have here a Spanish adaptation of Italian Renaissance forms combined with the Baroque, whereby we would combine and see this in Leon Battista Alberti's facade for San Andrea and Mantua, where we have massive central triumphal arch shapes flanked by others on the side, in this case 2 stories high. Turning to sculpture, Spain did not have a Bernini, which is to state that we did not have someone who was very original and innovative and pushed the limits of what could actually be accomplished in sculpture. Instead, they are dominated by a rather conservative tradition that is suspicious of iconographic and formal experiments. And we find that there are very few mythological and or historical subjects that are going to be carried out in sculpture. Instead, we mainly have religious imagery, saints, and those scenes associated with the Passion. Here, with Juan Martínez Montañez, we have an example of polychrome sculpture, which is very unlike that seen in Italy, where they would paint, as the ancient Egyptians, Romans, and Greeks, their sculptures to look as lifelike and as realistic as possible. So we find that this naturalism is meant to encourage an empathy and a direct confrontation with the divine and those subjects rendered and represented. This is, however, problematic for modern viewers, especially if you are going to be raised in America or Europe, outside of Spain, for we are uncommonly and not very appropriately versed in Spanish sculpture, as is not as well known. For instance, in Puritan America, it is much easier for us to distance ourselves and consider Italianate sculpture to be considered fine art, whereas Spanish sculpture looks much more like devotional imagery and is not really placed in the same category. For if we're going to view works of art that happen to be religious, it is easier for us to distance ourselves, since Americans are primarily Protestant and Puritan, from the notion of how they would have been used if they are whitewashed, quite literally. Now we know how people wanted to react to these sculptures because we have several accounts. They wanted the reaction, that being sculptors and patrons, to these works to be real. So as Antonio Palomino de Castro y Velasco wrote, I was so thunderstruck at its sight that it seemed irreverent not to be on my knees to look at it. For not only the head and the facial expression, but the hands and the feet were so marvelously executed that everything looked like life itself. Thus we know that the reactions to these objects were not to consider their aesthetic form and to contemplate their spiritual beauty, but instead to react to them like living people. Turning to Seville, Spain's largest city, we have a dominant artistic production happening here that shows us polychromy is going to be the most favored type of sculpture. Here, Alonso de Berruguete is going to be the dominant sculptor, representing the dominant style in Spain at the end of the 16th century. Here, the artist is going to live from 1488 to 1561, and he spent his formative years in Italy as a painter. Now, it's appropriate, given his training, that he would have admiration for Michelangelo, Hellenistic sculpture, and the dominant style of the day, mannerism. Now, mannerism, as we discussed, is going to be based on the understanding from Hellenistic sculpture that we marvel at how we see works from multiple angles. We are not supposed to look at something from one side and understand its direct impact. And so we still have this component of meravilia, or marvelousness. In works like Berruguete's Saint Sebastian, we have just such a work. This one produced in the Mannerist period from 1526 to 32. The polychromy and lifelike nature of it can be seen in details as careful attention is paid to the flesh tone, the pink nature of the lips, the colored iris, and then the colored hair. Saint Sebastian, of course, is going to be tied to a tree and shot up with arrows here, thus, of course, almost nude, and as an imitatio Christi, Christ-like, is going to imitate his loincloth. Saint Sebastian was martyred in 288 under the Emperor Diocletian, as he was tied up and shot full of arrows. He is then dumped in a gutter, found by Saint Irene, the patron saint of nurses, who discovers him and heals. He then returns and rebukes Diocletian again for his lack of faith and conversion to Christianity. Diocletian has him beaten to death and then dumped into a ditch. So we find that the brutality suffered by the body of Saint Sebastian is often shown by the multiplicity of arrow wounds in his flesh and often blood dripping down. This is minimized in the Spanish example here. Now, looking at this particular sculpture, we must note that the head is looking down and tilted to his right, whereas we find his legs are going to be twisting in the opposite direction. Like Michelangesque sculpture of the same time period, exactly the same time period, such as the Victory here, we see that the interest is in complex poses and multiple viewing angles. Thus, of course, we still have the remnant of mannerism seen in this sculpture, as the bodies, notably, are going to be contorted in opposite directions. Thus, we are paying attention to the elegance and the posing of this S-shaped figura serpentinata, or serpentine figure, as they are posed like an upward-licking flame. Turning to the official Baroque approach to sculpture in Spain, we have Juan Martínez Montañez, who will dominate production in Seville, the largest city in Spain at the time. Now, this is fairly common. Sculptors in Spain would often collaborate with very famous painters. So Montañez here collaborates with Francisco Pacheco, who will be the father-in-law to Velázquez, and Alonso Cano, who's going to be the painter and architect we talked about, who designed the Granada Cathedral facade. They would be paid to finish the surfaces after the sculptor had completed the work. And we know that he trained in Granada with Pablo de Rojas until 1580, and then would make a name for himself in sculpture. Here, Juan Martínez Montañez's Christ of Clemency is going to demonstrate the realistic approach to sculpture in Spain. He moves away from the complex positioning of the body in the maniera or mannerism. For now, instead of having the lower part of the body twisting the opposite direction as the upper, Christ is going to be conforming to the description of the Inquisition here in the Catholic Church, with his head lowered, looking down to his right, towards the saved, away from the damned, and the sinister at his left. Thus, of course, in the Last Judgment, he will also look to the saved to his lower right, or our left. But we can see all of his body from one angle now. We needn't move around him. Now, this is why we see how he is dubbed El Dios de la Madera, or the god of wood at the time, for he is able to create something that is incredibly lifelike and believable, made even more so and relatable by the painting added to it in the polychromy by Francisco Pacheco, where we have blood streaming down Christ's brow as the crown of thorns cuts into his skin, and then, of course, the lifelike painting of his flesh, the differentiation between his nipples, lips, and eyes, and then the rest of his flesh that becomes pale as the blood drains from him. The existing polychrome tradition can be seen in earlier works in the Renaissance by Pompeo Leoni, which made their way to Spain, because they already appreciated this polychromy in the 16th century. Again, we have a very powerful physique, but of course a more twisting and defiant Christ from the Italianate tradition seen on the left. From the Spanish tradition, he is much more realistically proportioned and anatomically correct by way of an average man on the right. Now, we know that how Christ is shown, and all religious imagery for that matter, is strictly and rigidly controlled by theological requirements. And we know that members of the Inquisition are in each city, ensuring that painters and sculptors are going to be adhering to these descriptions. According to the Catholic Church and the Inquisition, Christ must be shown with 4 nails, that being, we can't have one nail through both of his feet. They must be shown separately with his feet crossed without a support, showing how much he suffered. The precise instructions for this particular instance to Montañez are provided by an archdeacon, for he must be shown, quote, alive, before he had died, with the head inclined to the right, looking to any person who might be praying at the foot of the crucifix, as if Christ himself was speaking to him and reproaching him, because what he is suffering for the person who is praying. And therefore the eyes and the face must have a rather severe expression, and the eyes must be completely open. Now, this, of course, is contrary to how Christ is shown in the previous century, which is always dead, having been deceased and passed on after Longinus stabs him in the side. This goes along with the revival of showing Christ alive right before death, such as in Rubens' Elevation of the Cross, to be made in 4 years after this one. Now, Juan Martinez Montañez, in his St. Jerome here, gives us a specifically Spanish type of sculpture. This St. Jerome produced between 1609 and 13 for St. Isidore del Campo in the monastery here near Seville. We have a relief sculpture behind him with his lion set in an ascetic desert where he dies, as he's going to be beating himself in the chest looking at a cross towards the end of his life. Now, this is a mixture of the conservative conventions that we have seen previously and a new artistic language, for it has the dual function of both a retablo and a passo. So a retablo is going to be a removable relief sculpture, and a passo is one carried on a float. Therefore, these passos are going to be quite common in Spain and areas affected by Spanish colonization, such as Central and South America, to this day, where they will carry religious carvings and or people playing different roles through the streets on holy holidays. So we must imagine the St. Jerome removed from its relief and its shelf here, carried in a procession. The most important sculptor in Castile was Gregorio Fernandez, who settled in Valladolid, the Spanish court's capital, from 1601 to 06. He will be influenced by the very elegant lines and fine anatomy of Pompeo Leoni, as we discussed here, whose work is going to be found in Spain since the latter 16th century. He also, importantly, creates interactive floats that are in museums today of polychromed figures, usually carrying out episodes from the Passion to make them as lifelike and as relatable as possible. Here we see Christ's tormentors dressed in contemporary Spanish attire from 1619. Here we have his reclining Christ, a more famous example, which was given to the Capuchin convent at El Pardo by Philip III. Originally, this would have been at eye level in a retablo, so of course it could be seen in a relief, directly beckoning and interacting with the spectator. Here, this reclining Christ is shown dead, taken off the cross. The wound in his side, of course, is going to be showing us that he is dead. He's already been stabbed by St. Longinus. He is turned, very specifically, still to the right in a dialogue with the viewer, very carefully polychromed and as realistic as possible. So we are supposed to have a very empathetic and direct response to what looks like an actual cadaver in front of us. The face as well, very naturalistically composed, with the wounds from the crown of thorns, the blood trickling down his body, and the bloodless lips and eyes, showing us that he is drained and life has left him. This, of course, is a great example of Spanish polychromy and of the religious works that were commissioned by Spanish sculptors at the time. Turning to royal portraits, we begin with Leone Leoni and Pompeo Leoni, father and son, who produced monumental bronze portraits for the royals of the Spanish court. So the Spanish court sought monumental works from Italy in the 16th century, especially in bronze, because it was the most expensive and highly prized. There were no Spanish artists who had the ability to create these massive works at the time. So Pompeo, Leoni's son, is going to train Spanish assistants in El Escorial. But the casting of the actual work still took place in Italy. So Italy still dominated this practice by the turn of the 17th century. The model for what later Spanish monarchs would approve of comes by way of Pietro Tacca and his equestrian statue of Philip III. This, being very expensive, was a gift by the Grand Duke of Tuscany to Philip III to cement their relationship. In it, we have the rearing horse and the king on horseback with the very popular stiff ruffled neck in full battle attire, commanding his steed on the model of a very famous predecessor. That being the monument that Christians believe to be of Constantine, but was actually Marcus Aurelius. So all equestrian portraits of a commanding officer riding a horse comes from and are modeled after this example, where Marcus Aurelius raises his right hand in a gesture of clemency, which gets co-opted into a gesture of power as the baton held by generals in battle is going to replace it, as seen here. The horse, of course, striding forward, lifting its upper left leg, and then showing the commanding power of Philip III as he is controlling the horse that represents his nation. Here we find it's actually based on an earlier design that Tacca had designed for Ferdinando I, a Grand Duke of Tuscany, and is going to be one where he holds the baton of power in his right hand, looking to his right, while his steed, of course, is going to be under his control, looking down. A very similar design, as they both are wearing contemporary armor and showing off their credentials as a general. So this basis on a Medici monument provides a jumping off point for future Spanish monarchs. The striding of this general is going to be seen throughout the Renaissance in equestrian monuments such as that of Gattamelata by Donatello and others, whereby someone will be in military attire and shows the military might and control over the military that the individual riding the horse has. The son of Philip III, Philip IV, would order another one of these equestrian monuments, but wanted something akin to the portraits produced by Rubens and Velázquez. Instead of a striding pose, as was more common in the Renaissance and antiquity, he wanted a more appropriate Baroque action pose. The portraits of Rubens and Velázquez, which were produced in the early part of the century, are going to show a rider with a rearing horse on a very dramatic diagonal composition, showing the power, drama, and action of the rider and his ability to affect change and action in his military might and conquests. Now, the Florentine workshop, founded by Jean Bologna in the 1560s, would be the one charged to complete this. So we know that this foundry, and with Pietro Tacca trying to accomplish the impossible here, faced immense technical difficulties, for this was the first equestrian monument with a rearing horse and rider, meaning that it was incredibly imbalanced. All of the weight of this very heavy metal sculpture had to rest on just the two legs and tail of the horse. This had been proposed before, a century earlier, by Leonardo da Vinci for Francesco Sforza, the largest project that would have been designed for the Duke, with a reigning horse and an enemy below. The same motif would have been used and known by Leonardo and was produced by Piero della Francesca in his Battle of Heraclius, here where we find a rearing horse over a fallen enemy below him, but was never attempted as a colossal freestanding statue for technical reasons. Leonardo had even designed it in a small statuette and modello, showing how the final version would have appeared with these rearing horses in very active poses. The technical difficulties, of course, are going to ensure that Leonardo then opts for a pose where the horse's forefeet are on the ground. Now, the statue produced by Pietro Tacca, who's in Italy, was based on a bust by Juan Martinez Montañez, the god of wood that we just looked at. Now, the truly Baroque equestrian portrait that we see here, after solving the technical difficulties of balancing the rearing horse, are very dramatic and very impactful. So we find here that instead of drawing in the baton close to the horse in a closed composition, it is open. The rider is going to confidently hold out the baton as he controls his rearing steed, who rears up, the head of it jutting out instead of demurely being pointed downward like in the portrait of Charles I. We find here the legs also are rearing up, so we activate many different planes. It's a very, very dramatic presentation. From the back, we can also see the sash and the tail of the horse further communicates the billowing of the wind and the forward momentum of horse and rider, thus giving it a very powerful, powerful impression on the spectators in the surrounding plaza. This drama will be carried on in painting with Ribera and Zurbaran that we'll discuss next time, that begins with Italianate influences and then begins injecting local Spanish tradition.